And we have got a great speaker here. This is Mark Thomas. He is a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and is on the Central Committee. He's the workplace, and he's one of the workplace and trade union organisers, and he has written extensively on fascism and also in our International Socialism Journal. Quickly on the ISJ and other books that you can get in Bookmarks, which is just on the ground floor of the Grad Centre. There's a couple relevant books this meeting I'd like to point out, The Ghetto Fights and Fascism by Trotsky. But yeah, without further ado, I will just hand over to Mark to kick us off.
Let me choose that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Comrades, the beast is back. By beast, I mean fascism here. The 77 years since the liberation of Auschwitz, we again face serious and dangerous situation with the growth of fascism. That phrase, actually, the beast is back, I take from an article by the late Chris Harman, editor of Socialist Worker of the International Socialism Journal, a brilliant article, written nearly 3 decades ago, when we start to see the rise of the BNP and the National Front and so on. In those intervening decades, the beast has grown and become even more dangerous and threatening. I mean, just, for example, there was a very good session this morning about Le Pen. We now face 89 members of Rassemblement National, the main fascist party in France, in the French Parliament, a record number. 2 of their number have been appointed among the 6 vice presidents of the French Assembly, thanks to the votes of Macron, by the way, and his supporters. In Germany, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, is increasingly dominated by its fascist wing, led by a rather sinister figure, Björn Höcke, their would-be Führer, which is really laying the basis, I think, for the first really mass fascist party in Germany since the collapse of the Nazi regime in 1945. Another example, Italy. People may be more familiar with the Lega, the racist Lega of Matteo Salvini. But since Salvini entered a government headed by a former Central European banker, the compromises that's involved have opened up a bigger space for a party people may be less familiar with, the Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, which traces its roots very clearly to the main successor party of Mussolini's regime, the old MSI. Now, we have Trump, if you look outside of Europe, who has emboldened domestic US fascists, incredible, the Proud Boys and so on, seeking to actively use them as the sort of shock troops of his attempts to get his supporters to storm the US Congress on January the 6th to reverse the results of a democratic election. There are plenty of other examples, frighteningly, that I could point to. And I think we have to start off by grasping that the succession of crises of neoliberal capitalism that we're living through in the last decades, which is deeply destabilizing the economic and political structures of liberal capitalism, and not only allowed the fascists to grow, but the fascists are seeking to actively intervene in that political crisis to build, but also to try to remake society in a much more authoritarian and racist direction. Now, what am I going to try and do in this meeting is, I'm not primarily, it's a very important topic, talking about the nature of fascist states and so on, but we face fascist movements. And to be honest, comrades, if they ever form another fascist state, it represents a staggering defeat, and we're in the concentration camps. And therefore our goal has to be to stop them ever coming to power again. And I think that requires clarity, understanding the nature of fascism, and avoidance of often surface impressions about what fascism is. And I think there are considerable obstacles to fascism. So I have a kind of modest aim, that's a limited aim, is to try to seek to deepen our understanding of what is fascism. Because if you don't start with that, how can you understand its contemporary variations, and indeed its weaknesses, and a strategy to defeat it? And I think there are considerable obstacles to it. It's not just people are confused, they don't. If you look at how the ruling ideas in society of those in the ruling class. How does the ruling class and its ideologists, its journalists, its academics and so on, talk about fascism? No wonder people are hugely confused. The dominant idea in liberal capitalism is that fascism is just a historical relic. It can never happen again. There's a whole, it's impossible again. The same people who say that will then simultaneously, when there are far-right or fascist electoral rivals, a Macron or a Hillary Clinton and so on, will bang the drum and say the left must vote for us, as your enemy, because of the threat of the fascists. We're the lesser evil, and try to corral the left. Always a disaster, as we've seen Macron does a deal with Le Pen and so on. If that wasn't confusing enough, every time Western imperialist states go to war, they will tell you that you must support the war because whoever the enemy of the day is certainly a new Hitler. They said this about NASA's anti-colonial struggle, a progressive movement in the 50s. They said it. People remember back to the 90s. Perhaps some people don't. Went around then. Milosevic in Serbia, Saddam Hussein, Putin today. Now, often these are nasty regimes, there's no question. But effectively, again, it confuses the question of what is fascism. In fact, runs the risk of trivialising and downplaying the sheer scale and horror of the Nazis' barbarism, for example. So there's this constant tendency to dissolve what is distinctive and specific about fascism just into wider right-wing, racist, authoritarian movements. Thirdly, ruling class ideologists also insist on one thing, that they insist on denying that capitalism has any responsibility for fascism. I mean, inside academic, and what people are taught in universities, there's been a resurgence of liberal ideas of explaining fascism. And the dominant idea you come across, particularly associated with a guy called Roger Griffin, but there's others, is it's a form of revolutionary nationalism, which sounds, on the surface, possibly an attractive explanation, because it seems to suggest that they're not a normal party, which is true, that they want to break with liberal democracy, which is also true. But it's that word revolutionary. It's an attempt to stress that they represent some kind of, perhaps different than the left, but a challenge to the existing and prevailing order, which obscures and hides the role of capitalism, the role of ruling class politicians and representatives and so on as accomplices and allies that ultimately pave the way and hoist the fascists into power. So, in other words, a kind of utterly irresponsible, a refusal to take responsibility for fascism, which is, no wonder people get confused when you get these mixed messages. On the left, I think there are much more serious popular traditions of taking, in the first instance, the threat of fascism seriously. After all, the left and the working class movement were its first victims of the fascists. However, here I think, again, the legacy of Stalinism carried through the communist parties is baleful on this, because there's a lot more to be said about this, but the fundamental argument of the communist led resistance and so on, and had a credibility around, but was the tendency to see fascism as simply a direct creation and product of the ruling class, controlled, created, directed from above. And actually that again erases what's distinctive about fascism in my view. So we need clarity, we need theoretical precision, and in the development of Marxism, theory isn't just something that pops out of brilliant individuals' heads. There certainly have been brilliant individuals, but it rests on a historical generalisation. And actually, just go on the books here as a prop, in many ways it's Leon Trotsky's arguments that I'm going to draw on, who I think had still the most outstanding contribution to understanding what the real nature of fascism is and therefore its real threat. Okay, so I want to just build up a number of elements for people to understand what fascism is. First of all, fascism reaches its peak in the interwar decades. So I want to draw on some of that experience. It's born out of counter-revolution. Not revolution, counter-revolution. Some of you will be aware, the end of the First World War, there's a whole wave of revolutions, not just in Russia, but across Europe. But the dark shadow of revolution, of course, the response of the ruling class, is a series of counter-revolutionary projects, army coups, right-wing authoritarian regimes, and so on. The Nazis in Germany and the fascists around Mussolini in Italy, which would both become the two fascist regimes in the interwar decades, emerge as the most extreme and most thoroughgoing of the counter-revolutionary forces swirling around Europe at the period. If you look at Hitler, Hitler would rail against what he'd call the Weimar system, the parliamentary democracy that emerged after the 1918 revolution. But his aim was not simply to restore what had gone before, the kind of semi-authoritarian regime of the Kaiser. His aim was to carry through a reconstruction of the state and its relationship to the working class. And he had a critique of the old order, of the old rulers, which could even sound almost kind of anti-establishment in some of it. What it really said is the mistake the old order made, the mistake that current conservatives made, is they're not ruthless enough. They allow some toleration, some space for working class organisation. And he really says, you're too soft. If we allow any work, even reformist organisation, can be the seed out of which revolutionary challenges to capitalism emerge. And therefore we have to smash even the seed. There can be no toleration of working class organisation. In other words, it's a counter-revolutionary project which aims at the annihilation, I choose my word carefully, not simply the legal banning and so on, but the annihilation of all working class organisation, from the most right-wing trade union leader through to the revolutionary left. All has to be destroyed. And it also therefore involves an utter rejection of any ideas of equality, liberty, democracy. I'll give an example of how thoroughgoing the counter-revolutionary vision of the Nazis were. 2 months after Hitler came to power, they organised the first boycott of Jewish shops, the 1st of April. Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister, infamous of Hitler, goes on national radio to boast, to celebrate. And he says, we have erased 1789 from history. Not just the workers' revolution, but right back to the Great French Revolution. Any notion of democracy is a seed of communism and revolution. It has to be wiped from the stage of history. And indeed, that's precisely what the Nazis would do as soon as they came to office. They'd wipe out all working class organisation. I don't have time to go into the detail. But I want to highlight a second aspect, therefore, of fascism, that marks it out from other forms of reaction and counter-revolution, which we have to understand. And is so central to the danger it represents, that the aim of fascism is not just a counter-revolution, but counter-revolutionary mass movement with a popular base in society that can be developed and ultimately hurled against the working class movement. To develop a core of ideological fanatics who are prepared to use any means, including risking their own life and limb, in a physical and all-out confrontation with working class organisation. And this will involve two elements we have to understand. First of all, it is a gathering of votes, building a mass electoral base that it can ultimately offer to the ruling class. And, you know, the Nazis did stand in elections. By the late 20s, early 30s, they emerged as a mass party electorally. By 1932, are the biggest, never the majority, but the biggest party in the German parliament. And on the surface, it can appear like a kind of conventional party. You know, contesting elections. Hitler used to proclaim that they would adhere to the constitution, they wouldn't seize power. What happened afterwards? You know, let's not speak about so much about that. In other words, they wore a mask of semi-respectability, hiding some of their real aims. That's the first thing we have to understand. The great crises that erupted in German society, the Great Depression, late 20s, early 30s, 6 million on the dot, deep crisis in society allowed them to build up this mass level of support. But alongside this semi-conventional, semi-respectable political structure is a second structure they built up, They don't just succeed through votes. The second structure is essentially the creation of a private militia, of a party army, of a paramilitary organisation, of street thugs that attempts to physically challenge the left. In Germany, the Sturmabteilung, storm detachments, the SA. 1930, it had 100,000 members. By 1932, it had 400,000. Imagine being a socialist in Germany at that point, facing that. Trotsky called it a battering ram, I think he was right, that could be hurled against the working class movement. And once Hitler's in power, it always had a fairly free hand, but it had complete carte blanche to carry through the physical murder, annihilation, torture, etc., of the working class movement. And indeed, and this is one of the points I think Trotsky is very persuasive on, in some senses, having this army of ideologically committed street fighters allows a degree of confrontation and destruction of the working class movement that perhaps even a military coup limited to soldiers and police and so on can't carry through. It represents a very unique danger. And the dream, in other words, it's not just the Nazis dream of this counter-revolutionary fantasy. They create the means to carry it through. And that's what's really distinctive about fascism. Now, this, I hope, makes it clear that it's a mistake to think about the fascists as just a sort of puppet, tool and instrument directly created and controlled by the ruling class. It has a social base of its own, particularly in the middle class, the small producers, shopkeepers, small farmers, some of the professional layers, more privileged white-collar workers in German society, who both resent big capital that's squeezing them, especially in the midst of a crisis, above them, but also fear slipping into the working class, fear the working class's collective organisations below them. This is a social layer in German society, for example. It's traumatised by the defeat in the First World War, by the revolution that follows, by the great inflation of the early 20s that destroys its savings. It has 3, 4, 5 years at most of relative social peace, and then it's plunged into the Great Depression. And that's the social layer who is really Hitler's answer. When that social layer is saying, how do we survive? What's our future? Hitler's answer is you throttle those below you, you strangle the working class movement. And that's the social layer that they built out. It is true that as that social layer began to abandon the traditional bourgeois parties who collapse in their support, it also pulls a section of the working class. We have a debate about Marxist theories of fascism. There'll always be some professors, but there were workers. This is true. This is how class society works. What's interesting is those workers who did support Hitler and so on tended to be the ones outside the big cities, in the smaller towns, in the smaller workplaces, and by and large were not members of trade unions, or certainly not members of the Social Democratic Party or the Communist Party. It was the more atomised workers who were more influenced by the social layers above them that pulled over to the fascists. And the fact, actually, that the fascists are able to build a mass counter-revolutionary movement, not directly under control, in many ways is why they are so dangerous, because they can hurl their support, their mass base, at the working class movement. Now, third point, counter-revolutionary is mass movement. If you want to build a mass movement like that, you can't simply do it, and they didn't simply do it, on proclaiming their defence of the existing order. They wore, if you like, a second mask, a disguise. They would disguise themselves as, in some sense, revolutionary, as anti-establishment, even anti-capitalist. Again, this is a pseudo-revolutionary disguise that they would wear. They would claim that they stood for a national revolution, compared to the social revolution of the left, that would create, this is a fantasy, a more unified and then resurgent nation. How would they do this? Because they would purge it of parasitical and usually foreign elements to restore national unity. So there's rhetoric. If you look at the programme of the Nazi Party in 1920, there's rhetoric about confiscating war profits, denouncing the great trusts, the monopolies of the day, the financiers and so on. But underneath, of course, there was always this essential, there's never a challenge to what they would see as productive national capital. I mean, if you think about some of the rhetoric of the contemporary far-right fascists, one of the words that props up is globalism. It can almost sound as if it's a critique of capital. It's not. It's always trying to national good, global, foreign, international bad. It's not actually a critique of capitalism. It's a nationalist worldview. How do we solve the crisis of society? It's because the nation is weak and divided. Why is it weak and divided? Because alien forces are dividing it. And that easily slips over into a racialization of those alien forces. What's the solution? They must be purged. How are they purged? They must be cleansed through violence. This is a vision. And the sort of image they try to create is under a fascist regime, there'll be this wonderful, having purged these alien forces, there'll be this utopia where labour and capital are reconciled, where the small producer will be the cornerstone of society. Of course, none of this happens under fascist regimes. And they substitute genocide, essentially, for that project that they can't fulfil. So in sum, I think you have to understand fascism, and this is what I take to be Trotsky, summarising Trotsky, is a counter-revolutionary mass movement from below that seeks to present itself both as semi-respectable and as a pseudo-revolutionary force. However, that's not the end of the story here, because no matter how much some bourgeois politicians historians try to present it, they do not come to power through their own efforts alone. They do not come to power through their own efforts. They don't build through their own efforts alone. There's a relative independence from the ruling class, and yet at every stage of the development of capitalism, the complicity of capitalism, of its political representatives, the ruling class and so on, is central to the story about how the fascists grow. A couple of examples. Some people try to see the hallmark of fascism in what's specific is its ideology. I think it's an extreme version of the ruling class ideology. I don't think it's that distinctive, except that it's more extreme. Nationalism, militarism, opposition to foreigners, hostility to the left and working class organisation. Take anti-Semitism. Don't believe for a second that the only anti-Semites in Germany, in the Weimar, are the fascists. The ruling class was saturated with anti-Semitism. The Nazis pick up and radicalise it. Contemporary examples may spring to mind. Think about Islamophobia and so on. It comes from the ruling class, then the fascists grab it and radicalise it. And if you look at Germany in the early 30s, really the ruling class itself was looking to abandon liberal democracy and establish some common, probably more conventional authoritarian regime. The problem they had was they no longer really had a social base. Their supports had gone to the Nazis. And what you see is the Nazi Party, and its leadership crucially, engaging from the early 30s onwards in a process of bargaining with the ruling class about entry into power. Exactly the same happens in Italy with Mussolini, by the way. And the second point I want to make is that the state machine, sometimes when you face fascist threats, people say, let the police deal with it. We don't need that demonstration, let the police deal with it. The leniency of the state towards the fascists is a consistent theme. Doesn't mean they always love the fascists, although often they're able to build big support amongst police and army and so on, but they fear the left more. And so again, the level of impunity that the fascists can operate on under the streets, they get more favourable treatment from the police, the courts, the judges, and so on and so forth. And probably the most obvious example is Hitler himself, who takes part in a failed coup attempt. He learns a lesson and shifts his strategy afterwards. The Munich beer hall putsch, which I think 14 people are killed, mainly police officers. If we were involved in something like that, and by the way, you'd be hung in Germany in terms of the law. Hitler is put on trial, which he uses to immense publicity, actually. The judge is nodding away. And he gets 5 years, essentially for trying to overthrow the state. Very comfortable prison he gets. He serves 8 months. 8 months. Again, that leniency is so central to them. The ruling class often also, and again, I think this is a familiar theme, incredible legitimacy. One of the turning points in the Nazis in Germany, eating into the mass base of the right-wing parties, was that in 1929, the main Conservative Party launched a campaign, a nationalist campaign against the Versailles peace settlement. What we have to, the point here is, they invite Hitler. They say, these people look energetic, we can use them. And they invite them into essentially a joint campaign. Campaigning. Of course, the Nazis are the most vigorous, the most dynamic, and the mass base of the Conservative Party, having legitimised them, you said they're respectable, they're in your newspapers now, so shifts over for the Nazis. If you look at Italy, it wasn't the Conservative Party. The main bourgeois politician, that sort of liberal conservative, a man called Giolitti, had been prime minister 5 times. In 1921, puts Mussolini on his electoral slate. That's how the fascists enter parliament. They haven't been very successful electing to get 35 MPs. Incredible legitimacy, thinking that they are going to benefit from drawing on, and they're going to win over the Nazi supporters, the fascists. It's the opposite that takes place because they legitimise. Now, and as I said, it's the Nazis that are hoisted into power. There's not a seizure of power or a coup. Yeah, thanks. The Nazis, in many ways, are not the first choice of the ruling class. They're the last option when they're backed into, they run out of other options, because they're nervous. Will these street thugs also be turned on us to seize our property? Is that anti-capitalist rhetoric, do they take it seriously? Perhaps Mr. Hitler doesn't, but what about all those supporters? Will they come for us? If we unleash the Nazis, if we hoist them into power, will the left rise up and launch an insurrection? So they're nervous about it. But as their options disappear, they turn to the Nazis. This is what happens in Germany, and essentially engage in a pact with the Nazis who are given power, because what they can offer them by this point is a mass social base to be directed against the left. They are given power. All those books with titles about seizure of power, they are given power. That's the truth. Now, got a few minutes left. I want to draw some conclusions, make a few points. Firstly, it can seem, when you see the rise of the fascists today, imagine being there in the early 30s with the stormtroopers and so on, that this is an unstoppable force, and this is certainly how they project themselves. But what I've described is a very contradictory organisation of movements which do not have all shared class interests. It's a cross-class and contradictory movement. Secondly, and following from that, if you combine this kind of fake anti-establishment rhetoric that at least some of your reporters take, but you also build an institutional base of semi-respectable parliamentarians and so on, and these two masks, in other words, that potentially leads to a very unstable organisation that can be pulled in different directions. And although I don't have time to go into the detail, I'll touch on the article I wrote in the International. Both the Nazis and Mussolini go through huge internal crises and splits on their road to power. The problem is this: they can survive that, and they did survive that, if they don't come under sustained pressure from a mass anti-fascist movement. But if they come under sustained pressure from mass, those tensions can explode, begin to throw them onto the defensive. And even the most powerful fascist movement, I don't want to underestimate the seriousness of the situation we face today, let alone what we faced in the 30s, but can be reversed, even as they seem to be close to power. But the key is precisely to build a mass anti-fascist movement. And there's two mistakes here. One is to say, and you hear these arguments today, look, fascism comes out of capitalism. Therefore, the people who fight the fascists must be anti-capitalists, must be revolutionary socialists, and so on. This is far too narrow. It was too narrow in Germany, when anti-capitalist ideas could command the support of millions, but was too isolated in the wider working class. It's certainly a huge mistake today with the revolutionary left. It has to, in other words, to fight fascism, the revolutionary left has to seek to draw in whatever chunks of reformist organisations, think Labour Party, think the Labour left, think trade unions and so on, won't be successful, but as much of it as possible to a common fight. And there is an objective basis for that possibility. If you think back to the point, the Nazis don't just destroy the revolutionary left, they will put even the most right-wing trade union leader in jail. Therefore, there is an objective possibility of what Trotsky called the United Front approach. The second error, and again, I hope this follows very clearly from what I've argued, is that the kind of argument that says we should rely on the institutions, Parliament, the Constitution, the President, and so on. In 1932, the Social Democrats said, we don't need a united front with the communists. We will look to the Constitution. And there was a presidential election in 1932. The incumbent Hindenburg, aging war veteran, he'd been a military dictator in the First World War. The SPD said, vote Hindenburg to stop Hitler. He's the lesser evil. Don't be reckless and stand into communist candidates and so on and so on. 6 months later, Hindenburg put Hitler into power. I think you can hear some echoes of those kind of arguments on the French left and the American left and so on, that kind of lesser evil. So we have to build a mass movement. Final point. The social crisis we face today, we don't live in the boom of the 1950s and 1960s when the fascists found it very hard to build any base. The crisis that we face has allowed them now to gather millions of votes. Millions of votes. In some ways, comparable even with what the kind of votes that Hitler was getting. But the social crisis today is not as deep as the Great Depression in 1929, yet. What the danger is if you like, an electoral fascism that's accumulated millions of support, but they still have quite a small cadre. You know, Marine Le Pen gets 13 million votes, probably only has about 50,000 members, quite small. You know, don't get me wrong, 50,000 more than you want to see, but compared to what Hitler had in 1931, this is much more. The danger is that as the crisis deepens, as their respectability grows, as they're legitimate, they can convert votes into street thugs. Indeed, if you look at the Alternative for Deutschland, they don't just stand elections, they test the water. They called a May Day demonstration against, provocation in Berlin. After the Chemnitz pogrom, the AfD organised under its own banner a march in Chemnitz in East Germany, 2019. Volkart Mosler was telling me that as well as going on to the anti-vaxxer protests and so on, they also tried to organise their own march. It wasn't a success. The point is they're testing the water. At some point, Marine Le Pen will make this turn. But we have time. We have a warning from history and what we see before us, but we have a time. But the key is understanding the nature of fascism and drawing the correct conclusions about what that means for the kind of anti-fascist mass movements. Not just that we should build, but we have built in the past, especially here in Britain and Greece and so on. That's the task, and we need clarity about who the enemy is if we're to understand the task at hand.
I think Mark's introduction was really important to lay down a foundation and understanding of how we deal with the situation we're facing today, and I think that's quite important. For a long period of time, we've had to think about, really think about fascism. We've had to think about the question of a right wing, and about racist ideas, but we've not really had to think about fascism per se. And a lot of occasions, I think, back in the past, Mark talked about their own ideas of painting everybody Nazis, but there was a sort of common sense idea that went around with people. I remember arguing with people that Margaret Thatcher wasn't a fascist. People would turn around and say, Margaret Thatcher's a fascist. No, she's not a fascist. Or even Nigel Farage, more up to date. Nasty right-wing ideas, but wasn't a fascist. We had to have a kind of objective scientific view of fascism, because if we don't, we won't be able to confront it when it arises. But I think the difficulty we've got just now is a much more dynamic situation, in my view, which is the worrying aspect of it. And we'll look at what's happening in America just now with Trump and the hearings that are going on about it. And it's quite revealing, the stuff that's getting pushed out from even his own supporters about how much he supported that uprising. Now, I don't think Trump's a fascist, but that dynamic situation in America is leading to one in which it's emboldening people who feel that they can actually take to the streets eventually, I think. It's almost amazing how it isn't actually touching his base. People just think, that's a fact, he can get away with that, and that's a worrying situation that's actually going to embolden the real fascists. Same with the National Front in France, that vote, I think, is going to embolden people as well. So it's a much more dynamic situation.
1 minute.
Kind of couple of points to to sum up, I mean, what makes it also dangerous is what Mark talked about at the end, is the whole cost of living crisis. You know, at the end, you know, and that can pull people in that direction. You know, so I think that's also, I think, a worrying situation. So I think, you know, but my main point is we cannot be complacent here about the rise of the fascism. And also, I think it's important that I mean, Mark's right about the can't confront things with radical politics, but we also, the importance of something like Stand Up to Racism, I think, is so fundamental because it challenges some of the, you know, the foundation of the ideas, the racist ideas that the ruling class put out, you know, and immigration and all the rest of it, again, emboldens the fascists. So my feeling is, yeah, you know, I think if we had this meeting a couple of years ago, it would have been 3 or 4 times bigger, you know, comrades. We have to get it, to sum up, correct, to get this how dangerous the situation is at the moment. Thank you.
Right, I'm from York, WP, and just less than 10 miles, I can't remember, maybe 8 miles from us, we have Linton on Ouse, which is the base. It was an Air Force base, which is proposed to take the refugees that will be going to Rwanda. So, of course, who do we have on the scene? The fascists. So what we did, we knew that they were up at Linton. So what we did, we organised a meeting. 2 things. We organised a very quick rally in town, and quite a number of people came along. That was just a short thing, and then we held a meeting, and we had the MP there that spoke. 70 people at that meeting from a range of organisations, including people from Linton, and in walked, guess who? 6 of the fascists. Piled into our meeting, went to the back, and after the MP spoke, they left. We organised, then we heard that they were planning a march in York on Saturday, just gone, yesterday. So we very quickly organised a counter protest. Of course, a number of us weren't going to be there because we were here. But we organised it, and what happened, they were planning their march from 2, and we organised our protest from
1 minute.
From 1. And apparently we managed to get, at such short notice, over 100 people. And they arrived. So a lot of shouting going on. We've seen, I'm sure that the videos have been forwarded to people here who will, I'm sure it will be reported in the paper. So anyway, they arrived, and there were about 20 of them. And the police put barriers round and shoved them inside the barrier, and we were all round the outside from what I could see from the pictures that I've seen, and they didn't march. And they did a bit of shouting, but they couldn't be heard because there was more of us and we were shouting louder. So what we're witnessing is precisely what Mark has just been telling us about. So we've got to be on our guard because they're trying to, they're trying very hard to take advantage of the situation.
So it's check shirt, just on the side there, just next to you, followed by a person at the back.
Yeah, I just want to follow up from the last comrades from York, because as she said, this is in a small way an illustration of the central point that Mark was making, which is the importance of the united front in fighting the fascists. And although, I think the problem about talking about fascism today is that it all looks a bit bleak, to be honest. 41% in France, Eastern Europe being swept by Orbanites and Polish right-wingers and so on and so forth, Vox in Spain. And I think what we have to say is that if you compare France with this country, they have a similar racist, filthy, imperialist background, yet you have to point to the fact that in this country, because we operated the United Front with the Anti-Nazi League and subsequent organisations, the fascists are marginal to British politics today. That's not to say they can't arise again, but they are marginal. And you compare that situation with France, where Le Pen is revoltingly invited into the Élysée Palace to have a chat with Macron, and you have to say why. And the reason is that in 1981-82, when we went to France to talk to the founders of SOS Racism, which was wanted to be a similar organisation to the Anti-Nazi League, they refused to set up a united front from below because their leader, Harlan Désir, was in the French Socialist Party and close to Mitterrand. The Anti-Nazi League, of course, sought the united front with the Labour Party, Neil Kinnock, various other people, Peter Hain and so on and so forth, but was always driven from below. So I think that the experience there should give us hope, because Mark also emphasised things are in the balance.
1 minute.
We have time, and therefore that is the experience which we have to apply. But I wanted to raise another point. I don't know how many of you have been listening to the Senate hearings over the last week, and I noticed that Alex Kalinikos, in his last two columns, is referring to the fascist attack on the Capitol Hill. Now that is a change of how we're looking at things, and I think that the evidence from the Senate's committee would indicate that Trump at one stage was prepared to join the Proud Boys and their kind to go into the Capitol and to lead the takeover of the Capitol building. He was actually, and history is very weird, comrades, he was actually prevented by his Secret Service detail from doing that, who said, "No, Mr. President, you can't go to Capitol Hill, you're coming back to the White House. That's an order." Now, that raises very weird political questions about the deep state and so on and so forth. But my point is that the polarization inside the United States, plus the immobility of the political system, the gridlock in the political system, does very strongly remind me of Germany post-1930, the Brüning government, etc. The inability of the traditional methods of the ruling class through bourgeois democracy to solve their problems. And therefore, I think we need to watch we need to watch the US situation with extreme vigilance, because it is fluid and incredibly threatening in my view.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody, thanks to Mark for the introduction, I don't know if anybody else in this meeting was also at the meeting on France this morning. So, I think these discussions are really, really important to be having, because at that meeting, which was a very, very kind of sharp, engaged meeting, there was a discussion around the fact that when you look at what's happened in France, the fact that the fascist Le Pen and the National Rally have now managed to get 89 seats in the elections. Is this working?
On and off.
Shall I just keep going? Okay, cool. And I think, really we have to look at the question that was being posed in that meeting, which is, what does that vote of 89 seats translate into? Does that, what are the fascists going to do with that? What's that going to translate into inside working class areas around France? It's terrifying. We look at the question of having to learn the lessons of history, and it's a very, very real question. And I think, sorry, it's quite distracting. I think what we're looking at is, following on from the previous speakers, is that we've got a quite general kind of toxic swirl in the situation of fallout from the economic crisis. We've got polarisation, we've got the collapse of the mainstream centre, and those ideas no longer being able to hold sway. And I think that, we do have to look at historically how fascism can emerge, and I think it was absolutely right the way that Mark drew out the question about trying to understand that there is a social base for fascism that can emerge. These are forces that are hit by the crisis too. For example, if you look at some of the dangers of what was coming up inside the anti-vax movement, particularly some of the early anti-lockdown demonstrations, not at all everybody, but if you look at the basis of some of the people that were driven to be on mobilisations, it was small business owners, people who were maybe in a situation, sort of middle class situation where they might be appealed by left wing ideas on the one hand. You might have been anti-war, might have felt they were anti-racist in some level in other ways, but they might have also been approaching the question of the crisis and the lockdown and everything else from how it impacts their material circumstances and without any connection to a kind of collective response that's rooted in working class organisation. And if you look at what's happened with Trumpism, I think it's right to be clear about the definition of fascism and to resist the temptation to say that anyone who's really bad, racist and horrible in the situation is a fascist, and to be clear about that. But there's clearly a fluidity and interplay with these forces, and certainly Trump gave a massive megaphone to forces of the far right, to the fascists, and we've seen a shift of racist populism into the mainstream of the establishment. And you've got the fascists using different tactics, whether the contrast of France and Austria to where they're going into the parliament trying to get seats, to what they were doing in Greece via Golden Dawn and going onto the streets and attacking people and building on that kind of street army basis. But whatever way you look at it, we have to look to that proud history that we actually do have here in Britain over the past 40 years or so, from the Anti-Nazi League to Unite Against Fascism, Stand Up to Racism, where it's about building that mass united front that says, we might disagree, I might not want to be arguing that everybody should be joining the Labour Party on the one hand, but I want to work with people who may still have that argument and go onto the streets. Work with people in different faith groups, want to make sure that the unions are brought to the centre of those mobilisations, like we did with the ability to defeat Tommy Robinson's attempts to grow. But the state racism that's been pushed to the top is opening space continually. So that united front method is really important. But I did also just want to end, and it really came out of the meeting that we just had in France, where you've got an organisation, part of the International Socialist Tendency, organising there and trying to do what we're doing in this meeting now, which is learn the lessons of history, approach the question with a Marxist analysis and understanding of how that social basis for fascism is a real danger in a crisis, and how we have to be revolutionaries in the situation, building organisations that can actually have an impact inside the movement and fight for the kind of united front movement that we need as a response, but also fight to get rid of the system that creates these threats.
So it was just person would ask, and then I will take the hearings.
Thanks, my name's Tom from Cambridge. I think we have to have a really clear understanding of what actually applying the United Front actually means, which people are starting to pick up on in the discussion, but also why you need a high level of politics to be able to implement that. Because I think that you can come under attack from others on the left, for example, that going and working in a United Front will mean that your politics is weakened, and actually, when you're trying to apply the method of the United Front, you come under attack from, different sort of pools from all over the place. The custodians of the state, when you're trying to fight fascists on the street, for example, the police, local politicians, other groups, and so forth. So when we had Nazis come and march on the mosque in Cambridge, several times, it's absolutely clear that if you don't have a decent position on standing up against Islamophobia and a high level of politics, you can't take forward the argument about why you need to defend the mosque in the first place. And then you come under all sorts of pulls, like we'll have a meeting in a church the night before, or in order to show our opposition. Or if you go onto the streets, you will give them oxygen and energy and so forth. I'm sure the comrade from York, they've been through all these with the people around you. And your ability to be able to build and put people on the street is about One, your systematic building of United Front work in the past, and you don't have to just do that through fighting fascists. You build broad anti-racist work. We're doing that, the stuff we're doing around Rwanda, having a practical impact now, but also it's about building a tradition of working with other people that you may disagree with over all sorts of other things in order to be able to implement that, or working in the cost of living crisis and so on. I think it's super important that we raise racism, that we raise the reason and how they use it in the other campaigns that we're working in order to strengthen our ability to pull together the United Front work when we need it to fight the fascists as well. That's not to say that if you haven't got permanent organisation, you can't do that quite quickly if you've got a high level of politics as well. And one or two people working really hard in the run-up to that sort of thing can do that as well. But you need both. You need politics and you need the tactic and strategy of building around others around you in the United Front.
So I'm from France, and what I noticed from how the far right rise in like barely 10 years, it's also due to cynicism and of confusion on the traditional political party. Basically, the Front National was nothing at its creation. It just François Mitterrand, socialist in the 80s, that wanted to annoy the right, so he pushed the Front National, Jean-Marie Le Pen, at the front. So basically the right would be too busy to fight with the far right to fight with the left. And basically, it wasn't a massive problem in the 80s because the Republican Front was really strong. So it was basically the deal that is a fascist could be elected, the left and the right will stick together. And this one held for decades, from basically the end of the Second World War until the 2010s. In 2002, Jacques Chirac, who was a right-wing, decided not to even debate with Jean-Marie Le Pen. He said, it's a fascist, I'm not talking with him. What happened is after 2008, so we got the financial crisis, people started to criticize more and more the economic politics that was held in France. We were really liberals. In 2012, François Hollande, a socialist, has been elected. The only tiny little problem is that he leaded neoliberalism politics.
1 minute.
And basically, what they say, to kick the left, to maintain the power, we're gonna present the Front National as a scarecrow. What happened is that the Republicans, so the right wing, were losing power. So they said, "Oh, we're gonna talk like the fascists." So basically, it started on the media. People on the right wing talking like the fascists, saying it's valid, we have to talk with them, and started to attack the left for not doing it. And basically, what happened? We have like a crazy debate between Jad Almana, who was a right-wing Home Secretary of the government of Emmanuel Macron, saying that the far right was too easy on the foreigners, and that too easy on the on the fight against Islam. And what happened is in the mind of people, and it's really insidious, is say, okay, being Islamophobic is okay, being racist is okay, because if the traditional parties say so, it's okay. A part of the left is also to blame. So basically what happened is when they want to defend their political orders, they're just gonna confuse people, start to speak like them, and so people doesn't see the matter anymore with the problem, with the far right. And a lot of people say now in France, well, voted for Marine Le Pen, it's like voting for Mélenchon or voting for Macron, so who cares? So I think now we have to think, when it's come to the mainstream media where far right speech is normalized, it's how do we say to people that's not normal, because now the Republican Front in France is against the left. So.
about lone wolves, terrorist attacks, and that, Breivik and so on. I think, one of our tasks in this situation is to dispel the lie that they are lone wolves. You have to point the finger at the enablers, the media, the politicians. Where do these Islamophobic ideas that the Muslims are an enemy within? They don't just come out of these people's heads. They're driven by quite powerful forces in society. So you have to point the finger. And the Trumps, they'll whip up an atmosphere and then deny and take no responsibility for the horrors that follow from it. And we have to force that. Secondly, there always has to be resistance and revolt, because imagine if these terror attacks take place and there's no response. It's going to embolden others. So we have to have a response to those. Comrades quite rightly and understandably have focused, if you like, on the anti-fascist movement and building united fronts, and that's central. But I think there's a whole new generation that is trying to enter into, look for political answers. And I think we do, and one of the things I think we can offer is clarity about fascism. I don't think you can take that for granted. You see, if somebody who's kind of getting involved politically says, the Tories are they fascists? Look, I understand where that comes from. In many ways, what people are trying to say is just how brutal and nasty they are. But do you know what? I've heard John McDonnell, who I agree with a lot of things, call the Tories fascists. I think that's irresponsible, because it doesn't arm people with an understanding of these things. So we have a responsibility to help educate a new generation about that, and of course to learn from them at the same time, because it's not clear to everyone. It's clear to many people. It's not clear to everyone. What's the distinction between state racism and fascism? It's not always clear. We have to explain it. We're utterly opposed to state racism. But fascism represents a movement that, if it builds, if it grows, represents an existential threat to the entire working class movement, to every democratic space, and it carries within it the potential for genocide. And therefore, it has to be stamped on. Hitler's famous, "My enemy should have smashed me when I was small." Let's learn these lessons, but that means clarity. That's absolutely right. That it's not just as simple as that there are fascists and there's an interplay. I think this has always been the case, though. As it's quite time to go into it. In Germany and Italy, before the First World War, there were the emergence of what you could call new rights, more radical versions that are more aggressive nationalists, more aggressive anti-Semitism, that would open up a space for what became fascism. That situation where we see the racism of traditional conservatives, and sometimes liberals and such, and social democrats, conservative parties that radicalised to the right. The main conservative party in Austria stole the programme of the fascists and went into alliance with them. Someone like Farage has moved from just being a Eurosceptic to indulging in some of the kind of far-right Trumpist myths. This creates a more favourable environment for fascist ideas to emerge. But first of all, you have to distinguish what's different about fascism. Then you set them and understand it in the interplay of what's happening on the right and in society to understand how they can emerge. Second point I want to make, Conrad talks very importantly about France. There's something else we have to understand. One of the arguments you sometimes get, quite a serious argument on parts of the left, including the revolutionary left, is look, the fascists grow out of the crisis of society, the social pain of neoliberalism, the cost of living. This is all truth. What we really need is more strikes, more economic struggle, and so on. And comrades, we need more of all of that, absolutely. Not enough, though. And here's the test case. How many of us, over the last 30 years probably, have looked enviously from Britain to the level of working class militancy in France? That's true, but Le Pen still gets 13 million votes. Because you have to translate the working class militancy, which can throw the fascists onto the defensive. They don't quite know how to respond, because it can expose, if they just line up with, Le Pen struggled with the yellow vest protest because she just lined up with the police battering people. Your anti-establishment rhetoric is suddenly exposed. She finds it difficult, but she survives it. Because you have to develop a mass movement that specifically targets the fascists, rips off those masks, shows them the Nazis underneath those faces, and therefore says, they cannot just be treated like any other party. They have to be driven out of the public arena, off the media, off the interviews with the press. They shouldn't be allowed to book your local scout hut to have a public meeting and election campaign and so on. They should be driven out of the public arena. And therefore you have to have a specific campaign that targets them. And in Britain, I guess, is in one way, it hasn't always been great in terms of the level of working class struggle. We get a whiff of something changing, don't we, in the last few weeks? But I'll tell you, one beacon of hope is that we have repeatedly, from the anti-Nazi League in the late 70s, through to Unite Against Fascism, through to now build anti-fascist movements that don't just involve the revolutionary left, but don't look to rely on allying with the liberal centre either, that have been successful. 3 minutes, okay, I won't go into that. Look, everybody knows, don't we, that the vast majority of people have been voting for the fascists. I live in Barking in East London. 10 years ago, I knocked on an awful lot of doors with a lot of other people to try to drive out the BNP. And every time a door opened, you had no idea what someone was going to say. The truth is, thousands of people voted for the Nazis. We drove them out. The vast majority are not hardened Nazis. It was softer forms of racism, right? My kids can't afford to live around here. True. But it's because immigrants coming in. Not true. That was the argument you had again and again. And didn't always win that argument, but you said, but don't vote for these people because they are Nazis, and we drove a wedge. However, here's the warning. I think there can be a hardening up of some of that softer racist support into something more akin to a fascist worldview. And I think that we had a very good meeting the other day here about conspiracy theories and so on. Because the scale of crisis in society means people say, why isn't society working? Why isn't it working anymore? Didn't it used to work? What's gone wrong? Is it some outside alien force, conspiracy theory, which can easily slip into the nation is in crisis, it's some foreign alien force that has to be driven out, hardening up, because the crisis is deepening and people seek for these. Society has never worked. It's always been class divided, but we've gone from the boom to the bust, and it's exposed and sharpened those classes. What we need is a class response. But we are in competition with the explanations being offered by the far right. Last thing I want to say is, look, millions of people, the fascists are not close. Hitler was appointed in 1930. They're not close to that. They're not close to that. But they are more entrenched than they were a generation ago. It's a serious threat we face. People hate them. One of the things you see is sometimes when Nazis break through. I remember in Sweden, just to pick one example, the Swedish Democrats, misnamed if ever they were, fascist party, broke through and there was huge spontaneous protests. Fantastic. But we cannot just rely on that spontaneity. People, and then they don't know what to do, and it fades away. It requires conscious political intervention and organisation to grasp that strategy of clarity about the Nazis, a clarity about the United Front. Don't just reduce it to the anti-capitalist left, but it has to be a movement that's about driving the Nazis off the street, which strangely the liberal centre isn't so keen on and can't be relied on and so on. And again, this is my last point. The evidence, not just speculation on my part, but the evidence from Britain, where consistently it's been that the SWP has been one of the driving forces of all of those United Fronts and so on. The experience in Greece, where Golden Dawn was smashed, a tough campaign by a mass anti-fascist organisation called Kirtha, but who was again a driving force of that was our sister comrades in SEC, in Greece and so on. The point I'm making is this doesn't just spontaneously happen. It requires the kind of political traditions that the SWP and its sister organisations in the international socialist tendency have built and absorbed and have learned from. Like the comrade in Bangladesh, I don't know enough about Bangladesh, and I look forward to learning. We should take it more seriously. One of the things I think we have to contribute, not all the answers, is precisely those experiences that we have built on that I think are worth learning because they can be helpful. They can be helpful. And therefore, I think, if we're serious about fighting fascism, you have to locate yourself in that tradition and be part of that tradition. And being a member of the SWP, you don't have to be a member to fight fascism, but to fight fascism effectively requires a kind of organisation and strategy that is embodied in our organisation, which has one fatal flaw: it's too small. and you can help rectify that.